It's always hard to come in and speak after something that's so compelling. So before I get on to the main meat of what I've prepared, this has been an interesting session, a very interesting evening. And I just want to make a little connect with what I've heard so far so that I don't end up saying something without reviewing what I've learned today from both the panels. When Avi called me, and so did Rasleen, and asked me to participate in this and told me about the two topics, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. Intrinsically, I should have gone for the corporate story, but I decided that I'd do something that I perhaps know little about, and after Ingrid's very compelling speech, I'm pretty sure I know very little. But since the topic today was all about growth, and I think a lot of people believe, though some companies still believe, it's firms and institutions that drive growth. I think it's really the real agent of growth in the world is the individual. And hence I chose this particular panel because inclusive growth is not, unfortunately, about the government, which at best can play a facilitating role. It's always scary when the government tries to get into doing things themselves. Or the corporate sector, which believes they drive growth, and we're all beneficiaries of that, but very often they catalyze growth. The eventual agent of change is the individual. And in some ways, if I may borrow from what Shankar said, Larry Fortensky with Liz Taylor on that fateful day, I forget the year, but I'm sure that fateful encounter did not depend on the institution of marriage, which caused them to meet. But I'm sure the outcome, and I don't know how it was, but the outcome must have been driven by the resources and capacity of the two individuals involved. So I guess it's important. It's very important to link back to what the distinguished speakers before me said, and certainly this very compelling story. I just decided I should lighten up the screen a bit and link back with another thing that Shankar said. The future will be controlled by nations that have the 3 C's: cash, commodity, and creativity. And clearly India was lagging in 2, and as everyone else has talked about, we seem to do well when it comes to creativity. But that's how successful countries perform. But if you talk about individuals, which is where my focus is going to be today, successful individuals, unfortunately I don't have the same letter for all the things I'm going to describe. A good, successful individual is one who has the focus, energy, passion, integrity, execution, excellence to do what he does or she does, and finally, creativity. So there is a common element of creativity there. I'm sure Larry Fortensky had to do the same. All 6 elements were important. But creativity ends up being the important link between what the macro system can provide in the cash, commodity, and creativity cycle, as well as the individual cycle. And that's where the best known quality of the Indian brand, and I think the best brand, we were struggling with some names, I think the best brand is the Indian himself. And sometimes we undermine what the global Indian has done, what the resident domestic Indian has achieved, what the diaspora people like ourselves in this room have achieved. And I think that's the best part of the brand. And creativity is the link between what the companies, what the governments can do, and what the individual can do. And inclusive growth is going to be the important link between what the macro drivers of growth and the micro drivers of growth come in. And within that is the boring topic that is often talked about. Microfinance becomes a very, very important part because finance plays a critical part in almost anything that this world needs. It's almost scary after the recent crisis to tell the world you're a banker, but nonetheless, finance will still play a part. And microfinance, I've put together a definition. Many of you know what it is. One thing for sure, it isn't. Microfinance is not charity. Microfinance is about allowing people to access quality financial services so that they can make choices that can enable them to raise their incomes, can enable them to have access to products, goods, buy assets, and also create some level of absorption against shock in the future. It's a medium to lift people out of poverty. And it's not just about lending. It's not about the proverbial money lender who lends money to you. It's about giving them services that are broken up into small pieces and can be accessed by them so that they can raise their levels of life. And it's important that it is done as per their agenda. It isn't done as per the agenda of the provider of the services. And definitely, the poor and the underprivileged should be beneficiaries. It's very important for the reasons I mentioned earlier. We all have to focus. If we believe in inclusive growth, we do have to ensure that the resource and capacity of individuals go up. And hence, finance becomes very critical. What microfinance is not, it certainly isn't charity. And I know I'm speaking about a topic, for those of us who still read a lot of Indian media, microfinance is now currently becoming a four-letter word, given what's happening with the industry, what's happening in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and with a couple of companies that have been in the thick of action, especially SKS Microfinance. But it's important to understand and take a balanced view of what's happening. While on one end, it certainly adds to the resources and capacity of individuals, on the other end, it does require people, firms, on the demand side to create opportunities which can harness this opportunity and make it commercially viable. So it clearly isn't charity. If you do need something to sustain itself, it must pay for itself. But on the other side, it is not meant to be predatory. The intent is not valuation. The intent is value creation. The intent is to give or create value. If everything is going to be based on a concept of creating valuation, then we run a huge risk. And remember, I said there were 6 important ingredients to make an individual successful. One of them was integrity. You must be able to pay back for capital, but you don't have to make this one of those high-return capitalist opportunities where you end up finding that you're highly levered, where you end up finding that you can't sustain it, or you're using predatory practices to do things that end up destroying the very same thing that you're trying to create. It's all about empowering people, enabling success, and enriching lives. If we want India or the world, and I think with 1 out of 6 people in the world being Indian, we need to take this context of inclusive growth slightly out of India. In some ways, as Indians, we are all beneficiaries of some philanthropic or inclusive growth programs that may have happened in the past, for whatever reasons. Whatever agenda of globalization may have happened, we all benefited from education. We were picked up by multinationals. We were allowed to move out. We were allowed to benefit from some of the stuff that we are today recipients of. But today the world, in the last 3 years, has seen perhaps one of the worst crises. And the reason is, instead of empowering people, enabling success, and enriching lives, people have ended up looking at things very differently. And I'll dwell on that a little bit more later. It's important, and I'm borrowing a line or a phrase from Jacqueline Novogratz. I had the good fortune of meeting her last year when she was in Dubai. I spent an evening meeting her. She was very inspiring. And it was a term that, until that day, almost sounded like an oxymoron to me. How could capitalism ever be patient? And that's the day where I learned that it was possible. If we believe we need to have sustainable growth, if we need to believe that we don't run out of juice, not just within our lifespans, but really beyond us, and if we believe we're going to leave behind a legacy that is going to be talked about, and our children and their children are going to be beneficiaries, then it's very clearly important that we allow people to grow at their own terms. It's very important that people are able to access and make choices. It's not about a company's agenda. It's not about a bank's agenda. It's not about a financial institution needing to fulfill its targets. It's about making sure that the recipient can receive it. It's very important, again, while we are talking about microfinance, it's important to integrate, and there's this complicated chart that we just try to put together, something that we learned in the IIMs. But it's essential that the corporates, donors, governments, players, all get together and understand that they have specific roles to play in this part. And if each plays the part it's best at doing, then success is inevitable. But the return should be measured not, and this was Jacqueline's gift to me, is not to be measured in terms of the ROE or the ROA that you make on the asset, but certainly in ensuring that the capital gets paid back 95% to 100, 105%, because sustainability is important, but more importantly in the social value you create. And how do you bridge the difference? You bridge the difference because big corporates, manufacturers, medical device manufacturers, FMCG companies, if they want to eventually grow and sustain their own industries, they have to develop not just the top 300 million high growth, high pace, whatever you call it, the middle class, which is today as good as any other segment in the West. But we also have to worry about sustainability that will be required for the 800 million other people who earn less than 45 or 50 cents a day. And that's where the development aspect, and I think we heard that story a bit, is very important. That's where the Indian creativity is going to be important. That's where the role of the government is going to be important. For the size and scale of countries like India and China, there is just no way traditional methods can work. And that's where the role of microfinance and how it gets channelized in the last mile, how it gets administered, and how it catalyzes and dovetails with other participants in the real economy is going to be very critical. And the basic ingredients of microfinance institutions is really three players playing together. Governments should only play a part where markets are not capable of playing a part on their own. And very often governments have this irresistible, Sanjay, due apologies, but have this irresistible urge to jump in and run businesses, which they're never geared to handle. But they certainly have a role to play. They have a social mission. And again, we're talking about countries like India, which are very populous, not enough in cash, not enough in commodities. We just have a large population, and that's the strength we have to harness. So it's extremely important that there is a partnership of capital, innovation, and of course social entrepreneurship. Even the US, Obama is now launching social innovation funds where the government is putting money aside, but it's giving it into the hands of entrepreneurs who know what to do with it. And that's the important piece. And that's what that quote, which is there from Muhammad Yunus up there on the slide, I can't read it from here, I'm sorry, I'm challenged. But it does say that all people are entrepreneurs, but many don't ever have the chance to find out. So if there are 69 billionaires in India today and $100,000 millionaires in the country, and there are all kinds of global names and global brands that we talk about, from just 300 million, middle class, that is the market everyone wants to harness, can we imagine how many more might lie in the 800 million that we haven't even tapped? And I think that's where Ingrid's story gets more compelling.